Okay, hello everyone. Thank you all for those that are signing in or coming into our weekly Proseminar speaker series. I want to thank everyone for being here yet another week, and I'm very excited to introduce this speaker. If you have not attended one of these talks before, you can see that we are both physically in person in the room, but we also, many of us are signing in virtually, including our speaker, even though he's in Rome and it's evening time, has very generously offered to share his work with us. So I'm very excited about that. For those of you that are virtual, please go on mute so that we don't hear you. If you have questions, you can put them in chat and we'll wait till the end and I'll field those questions for you, or you may be allowed to unmute yourself to ask a question of the speaker. Same here in person, obviously. We may have some questions in person too. So please just stay on mute. All right. So I'm very excited to introduce our speaker, Miron Marvan. He's an archaeologist who received his degrees from Escuela Nacional de Antropología y Historia in Mexico City. He's also out of UC Berkeley, so we have some ties there as well. He has worked in the Maya region 20 years, since 2002. For quite some time, he has worked in the Maya region, particularly in the area of Chiapas and southern Mexico. He's a ceramicist by trade, but as you'll see in this talk, he is branching out and doing some other really interesting things. His research has focused on culinary practices through ceramics. And of course, he's currently carrying out ethnographic research with the Maya Chol communities and their relationships with heritage, archaeology, and memory. He has authored and co-authored a number of archaeological reports and publications in various Spanish language venues and monographs, including Bacal, Arqueología de la Region de Palenque. He obviously has some chapters on ceramics and his specialty. And he also has created a YouTube channel posting a series of short archaeological lessons in Chol Maya language. So I want to thank him for sharing his work with us in his talk entitled Mayanist Archaeology Through a Decolonial Perspective, Challenges and Opportunities. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Esteban.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And thanks also to the UNLV to inviting me. I am very excited to share with you what I'm doing now. And I think I'm going to talk to you about a lot of challenges we Mexican archaeologists have. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. You have it there? Okay.
Yes, we are good. Thank you.
Okay. Well, first of all, as a sort of a disclaimer, I want to say that I am not talking on behalf of any indigenous individual nor collective. nor giving voice to anyone. For the last 5 years of my professional life, I have been doing what I think is needed to be done in Mayanist archaeology, which is trying to listen to the contemporary Maya voices that talk about their past and its materiality. This is a field of knowledge that converges with our Western notions of archaeology, heritage, nation building, and touristic capitals and markets. There is a lot of colonial power structures at work in Mayanist archaeology, which is part of Mexican and Latin American practices and legal systems. So I am going to be talking about problems caused by our practice and narratives in the indigenous contexts, and what can we do to address them. But the main focus of our interest, if we want to really open our practice to decolonial scrutiny, should be what different Maya individuals and collectives are already talking about. And as Lisa said, I am a Mayanist archaeologist. I have spent the last 20 years of my life focusing on the ceramic material from the late classic at the Palenque region, northern Chiapas in southern Mexico. And most of my professional life has been submerged on thousands, on hundreds of thousands of ceramic fragments, living the illusion of thinking exclusively about the classic period. But at the same time, I have been hiding from the hegemonic contexts that make archaeology necessary or even relevant. The way we do archaeology in the Maya region and in Mexico is not sustainable. We appropriate our object of study responding to state hegemonic and extractive conceptions of heritage, which violate collective indigenous rights that both the Mexican state and us, archaeologists, should have started to think and discussed how to grant. And that sooner or later is going to effectively change us if we are sufficiently receptive for good. But if we don't listen to the native voices that are already questioning our practices, we are doomed to be even more socially irrelevant than we are today in Mexico, condemned to contribute only to urban development and the display of wonders for the touristic market. The Mexican state and society have appropriated the territories, the resources, the histories, and even the bones of the ancestors of the indigenous peoples of today. And this appropriation is granted by our Mexican federal laws as a right of all Mexicans equally. And after about 150 years, mestizaje and indigenista policies have been very effective, creating an imagined collective that homogenizes the immense cultural diversity into a single Mexican subject. On the last decades, different disciplines have worked together on the field of critical heritage studies. They have discussed about the social phenomena that turn around identity, memory, time, and history. And these studies tend to define heritage as a collection of cultural practices, along with their materiality and spatiality, to use as a mirror for the people in the present. These critical discussions have conceived heritage as a product from the relation of people, objects, places, and practices, abstracted as a dialogue frame on which human and non-human agents work together. In many places of the post-colonial world, there has been a reflection on how heritage takes place, on how politics and identity are entangled with heritage, focusing on the lives of the people and the relation with their material past, instead of perceiving things and places to be celebrated and protected. And heritage operates at different scales of social identities, from the family to the community, the regional, and even the national ones. It is one of their creating forces, and it inevitably generates a wide spectrum of contesting and ever-changing definitions and memberships. As Waterton and Smith say, multivocality and dissonant discourses are part of the nature of heritage, a situation that can be attested on how many scientific disciplines have put together this concept. Archaeology, anthropology, geography, linguistics, history, economy, law, art history, sociology, psychology, architecture, and many others. All these disciplines have converged into the subject of heritage. And there is a need to have a good grasp of what heritage means and to be inclusive in that definition, not only across the academic disciplines involved, but also among all peoples creating and being affected by heritage. About a little more than 8 million people in Mexico identifies with an indigenous ethnicity or speak in a language of one of the 69 native ones that remain in Mexico. They are, those 8 million are, as a colonial collective, the most direct descendants of the plurality of populations that dwelt during the pre-Hispanic times in what is circumstantially today the Mexican territory. Despite the relations imagined by anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians, a connection between indigenous communities and their ancient archaeological past is rarely vocalized by them, but clearly existent. And the fact that it's barely perceived in the public national discussions is because of the effectiveness of the state-sponsored ontological politics of heritage. The indigenous struggles are lost in the national noise of everything else, very easily confused with nothing. And different voices in Mexico and Latin America have warned for decades about the many colonial aspects on which our archaeologists develop, about how Mexican archaeology is in a symbiosis with the state, promoting a teleologic and linear vision of history, which has been very lucrative for the nations, keeping the indigenous groups at the margins, stopping them from having a meaningful participation with the archaeological legacy of their own past. The indigenous communities have been represented as people from other temporality, as belonging to the past, just part of a scenario that legitimate the touristic and folkloric value. All Mexican history still is heavily marked by Boasian anthropology, and we have a lot of difficulties getting rid of diffusionism and hyper-diffusionist narratives. The idea of centers of high culture and the idea of a cultura madre, a mother of all cultures, with the Olmecs, and the origin of the Mexican state, teleologically perceived as in antiquity. And current heritage legislation in Mexico promotes a national hegemony over the archaeological objects and places. Development projects exploit and commodify archaeological heritage for corporate and macroeconomic gains, offering indigenous people a marginal role as a workforce, and most of all, as an scenography for tourists, denying their coevalness with our own times, in the words of Johannes Fabian, thinking other people living in the past, which is of course absurd, but it's how it works. Nation states imagine themselves surfing in the crest of modernity, placing the indigenous into the past and blocking them from meaningful participation on the academic and administrative activities of archaeological sites. And now, I am a Mayanist archaeologist, but how can we define what it means to be a Maya? Maya, it's an etonym that groups together, an exonym that from the outside, that groups together peoples and cultures with a common linguistic origin, with 29 or 31 languages forming the Mayense family, linguistic family. And this concept encapsulates peoples that for about 4,000 years have dwelt in a region that includes five different countries, modern countries, with a wide variety of landscapes, including highlands, lowlands, coastal plains, swamps, volcanic regions, etc. And in this wide category, it fits a lot of people, from a skeleton from the pre-classic period excavated in the swamps of Tabasco, a ruler lady referenced in epigraphic monuments sculpted in the 7th century at Palenque, Chiapas, an inhabitant of the 11th century at Chichen Itza, a Celtal rebel from the 18th century, a Cruzop warrior from the Maya social war on the east of Yucatan of the 19th century, or also people that live today, like a member of the Zapatista Juntas de Buen Gobierno in La Realidad, Chiapas, or a Yucatec migrant in California. All of them can be considered Maya, although almost none of them would self-identify with the Maya category. That's a modern thing. And what we know as the classic Maya from the lowlands was an intense time period from the 1st until the 10th centuries of this current era, when it was displayed a complex network of political systems competing with each other that resulted in a lot of urban developments and heads of small kingdoms called Haulelop, which produced a copious amount of monuments, historical mythological texts that legitimated the families with power, and that, you know, for the general public, that seems to be what it means to be a Maya, belonging to that past. But you know, it's, as I just told you, it's much more complex and much broader than just that. And the same objects with which the Uhula Hawab, or their ancient rulers, and their families showed their political and economical power, have been appropriated by national states. Those hegemonic imagined communities that in Latin America have been a product and continuity of colonial processes from the beginning of the 16th century. The Maya culture, as the people that speak in one of its languages are popularly perceived to belong, is something that did not exist prior to Western categorization. Of course, there were many Maya peoples, as we call them today, but as I just told you, it didn't exist before Western categorization. Its only common denominator, not at all insignificant, is a linguistic family with a shared origin in one ancestral language. The invention of the Maya concept could be attributed to anthropology that created the label to encapsulate cultural horizons and their boundaries. Mayanness is something continually produced, reproduced, and consumed by the practices of archaeology, tourism, the communities themselves, and the states involved with them. Classic Maya archaeology offers a wonderful heuristic adventure. It sounds a little bit over the top, but it really is. Where we can literally read the historical narratives produced more than a millennium ago and contrast them with long duration processes that we see on the material archaeological record. All the people that call ourselves Mayanist archaeologists, involuntarily and unreflexively, are immersed on capital and state interests. And in a lot of ways, we're just the serious facade of an extractive industry, walking along hegemonic ethno-nationalist discourse that pretends to monopolize the reproduction of the colonized people's history. First by Castellan Catholic West, the Castellan Catholic West from the 16th to the 18th century, and successively by the Mexican national state and society. And of course, the Maya peoples transcend the limits of Mexico. 11 out of the 30 related languages are spoken within the Mexican territory. The 2 million people belonging to this linguistic family in Mexico, because there are about 8 million in worldwide, including Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Belize, and even the United States and Canada, because there are a lot of migrants there. Represent about, well, and the Mexican side of it represent about a third of its global population. The other four countries with Maya-speaking communities have their own histories of colonialism, anthropology, and the construction of heritage. Among all Latin American countries, obviously excluding Belize, which is not Latin American, they are not Latin. They share a lot of histories in common and a lot of processes and structures that still prevail today. So more than being united by any kind of Maya cultural essence, they are instead entangled together by colonialism, indigenista and national policies, migration, commerce, and a touristic heritage market and its mechanisms. So the people that have dwelled for 4 millennia in the 300,000 square kilometers of the Maya area, in these 5 countries, have produced a large number of ruins and vestiges of Maya past. They are the material indications of the previous people dwelling in the same places as other archaeological and contemporary communities before. And without the help of any archaeologists, the people and their communities have constructed their own sense and explanations of the omnipresent archaeological remains with their own histories, categories, and chronologies. They have reacted to and actively changed the social realities with which they are and were participating. An aspect that has helped in the constructed aggregation of cultures in the Maya area is the fact that during the classic period, in a chronological framework that could not be more Western projected, the fact that we say classic, just as in the Greeks and Romans and the classic world on this side of the world, I'm in Italy right now, it's very telling. So between the 2nd and the 9th centuries of this era, the ruling classes, the fact, this aspect that has helped in the construction of this aggregation is that the ruling classes of hundreds of political units participated in a regional political network, which related the elite governing classes in the same political hierarchy through dynastic prestige, alliances, and open hostility, notably all written in the same Cholean language, despite the fact that different regions likely spoke different Mayense languages. And all this political and cosmogonical information is clear in the epigraphical record. What is not mentioned about those regional networks is the way that the Uhula Hawab, or the ancient lords, and their governing classes related to the specific ethnicities they respectively ruled on their homelands. The epigraphic records also attest how these elites were actively creating and adapting to shared notions of history, values, and place, as it was the case of the ruling classes of the post-classic central Mexico. The plurality of the different cultures within the Maya area is likely to be ancient, and as it is displayed in the large variation of archaeological styles, technologies, and practices registered in the archaeological record of all the region, of all the Maya area. There has been a selective representation and suppression of ancient Maya multivocalities through time. And the resonance of these discontinuities can be seen in the increasingly popular narratives that globalize the archaeological Maya with diffusionist ideas. They imagine intercontinental ancient connections between different cultures, and they also produce discourses conceiving now currently extraterrestrial influences from aliens, right? What it was perceived in the beginning of the exploration era as Phoenicians, Egyptians, Hebrews or many other types of Western identities now is conceived even more postmodern as aliens. It is interesting the fact that many people choose to see an alien causality of the archaeological record before acknowledging any historical continuity. Archaeology has to do a lot more than it does now to prevent these racist conceptions and narratives. You know, the fact that not giving them the merit of building great things and precise buildings and architecture oriented to astronomy and whatnot. We really need to do more to counter those racist arguments. A Yucatec scholar, Juan Castillo Cocom, has pointed to the way ethnogenesis has proscribed Maya people from a way to exist outside the nation states, reductive and politically constructed identities. He challenges the field of Maya anthropology to think beyond Western imaginary. There is also an increasing number of indigenous professionals in the fields of anthropology, archaeology, and most of all in linguistics. And some of them are redefining the sanctioned ethnicities and starting a dialogue seeking to engage their embodied academic along with their indigenous condition. So epistemic violence in the Maya area, as epistemic violence as Victoria Fricker defines it, has been produced by the global histories of discovery, academic investigation, and production of national prestige for the international stage. The processes that have been produced, the notion of the ancient Maya, have transformed the plural into an identity for display as a valuable commodity, as both as an archaeological subject and as a tourism object. It was the Maya ruins that introduced Mexico into the international circuit of tourism. From the experiences of the first 19th century explorers that promoted an exotic and monumental idea of the culture. The spatial proximity to the Maya touristic heritage of Maya peoples today affects the intensity on which indigenous communities relate with the discourses of archaeology and the capitals of tourism. Some of them have a long-term relationship with archaeologists and what we do. And they have belonged marginally to the network of markets and as commodities in the apparels of this particular industry. The side attractions to see after the splendorous ruins. And we can see here John Lloyd Stephens being carried in the back of the ancestors of some of my friends in the Palenque region. And you know, today we are not carried, fortunately, we are not carried like that. We can walk around, but still the relationship created by them, by those early explorers, has changed little, and it just in form, not in substance. So it's not very different. And all the dirt that we excavate, almost all the dirt that we excavate, is carried out in the backs of the ancestors of the people building those places. And the ancestor and the people that you can see carrying Stephens in the back. Right? So now talking about more recent times, there is a tendency in the state-sponsored Maya archaeology, as in all monumental ones, to study and represent the dominant classes of the past, to display a bright history. One of powerful civilizations, building spectacular places and temples, and ignoring the necessary exploitation to achieve such an ancient monumentality. The powerful people's archaeological remains are also more appealing for the touristic consumption. They are more amusing than the humble remains of a regular house. But it is possible that local communities are interested in other narratives than the greatness and the great kings and queens of the Maya region. And the laws that regulate archaeology and its institutions in Mexico are really behind the international agreements on human rights that my country has signed and ratified from almost 30 years ago. The discussions about science decolonization have changed effectively the way of doing research with native communities in different parts of the continent and the rest of the world. But at no point in the 8 decades of the existence of our National Institute of Anthropology and History in Mexico, there has been an interlocution between the scientific community and the Mayense-speaking indigenous peoples, or any other native language family, where the possibilities of sharing the custody, the decisions, the knowledge production, and the administration of archaeological sites, places that are ancestral testimonies of the existence of the very same people on which what circumstantially is today the Mexican territory. In that sense, the United States is ahead of us because you have been talking about these issues for decades, and not all the cases are exemplary or great, but you are leading. You're ahead of us in the sense of those discussions and those policy making. So Mayanist archaeology has extracted and exploited for more than a century the historical materiality of Maya peoples. So we have this long tradition of archaeological investigation, and at all times there have been Maya peoples around and involved with our endeavors. But their participation on heritage process have been limited to work helping with the excavation tasks and with the maintenance of sites, without making them co-participants on the epistemological and heritage management on which we are involved. One form of contestation, of Mexican Maya contestation, that has lumped together Maya ethnicities is the Zapatista movement, an insurrection army that started clandestinely in the 80s of the last century and was made public in 1994. It is still now a political force in the highlands of Chiapas and in the national debates about indigeneity and resistance. They are labeled as the first postmodern guerrilla in the world. Zapatistas have grouped together people from Celtal, Tzotzil, Ol, Tojolabal, and identities and languages, united by a shared history of oppression, anchoring a lot of memories in the finca times. In the finca is pretty much equivalent to a plantation in the southern United States. What the modern Chol call in their language, the Mosojontiel, translated as the time of slavery in Chol language. And these embodied histories bring together the different identities in resistance. Maya people's denial to colonial or political domination are not rare at all. Since the first centuries of the Spanish invasion, up until today, and the Zapatistas belong to that tradition. This is attested by the many moments and places of their histories when they have organized against hegemonic powers, either colonial or national. From the long and tenacious opposition to Spanish conquest in the Petén and the Selva Lacandona regions, the Yucatec so-called caste war or social war, or the Celtal, Chol, and Tzotzil highland rebellions of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And just as they have denied imposed conditions, they have been discussing about the use and custody of the archaeological heritage by indigenous peoples for decades. They have tried to call the attention of society and scholars of these issues, and we have not listened. 26 years ago, Los Acuerdos de San Andrés, the San Andrés Accords, were signed and it was a pact made through a dialogue between the biggest collective of indigenous people ever to be gathered in the history of Mexico and the federal government. That collective of indigenous peoples are later formed what is now the Congreso Nacional Indígena, the CNI. And all of the people participating in the mesas de trabajo were already thinking about the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention, better known as the Convention 169 of the International Labor Organization, which was ratified by Mexico in the early 90s. I think it was 92 that Mexico ratified that convention. So more than a quarter of a century ago, the federal government committed to make 5 recommendations to the National Institute of Anthropology in Mexico, which has the monopoly of archaeology in Mexico. And I don't get tired of repeating them. I'm gonna read them to you. The 5 recommendations are: it will be recommended to INA, this National Institute, that revise the disposition to 1. Allow indigenous people entrance free of charge to the archaeological sites. 2. Give to indigenous people a proper training for the management and administration of sites. 3. Share the utilities generated by tourism on those sites. 4. Allow the use of sites as ceremonial centers. And 5. Protect the sites when they are endangered by touristic development or looting. We have not listened to any of those 5 recommendations. In some cases, there is a de facto appropriation, but it's not because of the federal government or because of us archaeologists or doing something. It's because the communities have organized for that. So we're really behind, not just the postmodern decolonial discussions of academy, but also from what many indigenous collectives have been asking for many years. In my on my current PhD dissertation, I want to know what the conditions are to start the dialogues necessary to start a real change. What kind of forums are needed, and who would be the interested parties in proposing alternatives to our laws? I want to know the way they all conceive and narrate their own history. And to achieve that, I started 5 years ago an ethnographical investigation with conversation with all men and women about these subjects. So an overview of what the Chol are, there are more than 250,000 people, a quarter million people speak Chol today, and they have a very complex history, full of dispossession and denial to, both dispossession and denial to the adverse condition of exploitation. Since the creation of the Chol towns of Tila, Tumbala, and Palenque in the second half of the 16th century, and because of population increase, land necessity, and conflicts, recently the area that they occupy, that you see on this map, has expanded to the east and have pushed them to go to the Yucatan Peninsula coast and to northern Petén, as well as the west coast, mainly the west coast of the United States, but also in many other parts of the United States and Canada. Lactan, as they call their own language, is one of the Mayense languages with a closer relation with the one written on epigraphic text of classic monuments. One of the dialectal variants, the Tila one of Chol, even preserves the same particle to denote the perfective aspects of verbs, as in the classic Cholean that is written on classic monuments. And you know, the perfective is a form of tense very common on historical epigraphical text, something that has already happened. So if you read now out loud a transliteration of a monument, as epigraphists say it was pronounced, they understand a good portion of it. And even with that, even just a few of them establish a connection with those ancient histories because of the effectiveness of indigenista and state policies of the last 200 years or so. Most of the choles, when they talk about their history, they make emphasis on other temporalities other than the classic. Times that are, they fixate their memory on times that are more still present and in their current lives. For example, when they worked in coffee, rubber, and wood plantations, property of Americans, Germans, and people from Mexico, and Mexicans from the center of my country. All people pay a lot of attention to the foundation history of their towns and ejidos, to the histories of the construction of their Catholic temples, and to the Señor de Tila, a blackened Christ figure with a lot of regional devotion. Also to the stories about caves and the landscape populated by and owned by mythological creatures and characters that shape the way people conduct themselves on what they call the machelum, or the forest. For any extractive activities like chopping down a tree, clearing terrain, hunting, or even excavating the remains of the classic remains, an archaeological record, people need the consent of these mythological entities by the way of conjuring them and making them offerings. These beings or agents are one of the most common themes that I have found when people talk about what it means to dwell in their landscape. The traditional political system from many towns is put in practice during the Catholic cycles of agricultural and religious festivities. It is a set of cultural values endangered by many factors, including migration, social discrimination, religious conflicts, and others. There is a lot of displacement produced by these Catholic versus Protestant conflicts in the last 50 years. From 2018 to March 2020, I was starting to explain my research and the reasons I am doing it to some families in Palenque, Chiapas, that I have known from the last 20 years, and inviting some of its members to discuss their views on what we Cashlanes, as they called us, the non-indigenous Mexicans, and well, the non-indigenous in general, we are the Cashlanes coming from Castellanos, what we conceive as archaeological data and heritage. And at the same time, I was slowly getting acquainted with other Chol interlocutors from northern Chiapas and beyond. I was starting to have the dialogues towards my dissertation questions and also learning about new ones. It was often that while explaining the reasons of my investigation, I had to describe the generalities of archaeological methods and what we know about the classic Maya and the inscriptions in order to attract as much interlocutors as I could. I organized public talks with the help of several people working for schools, Casas de Cultura, the Chiapas state institutions, and Intercultural University of Tabasco. And that helped me a lot to meet a lot of choles that are interested in Mayanist archaeology and epigraphy and want to talk about and contest those ideas with the history as they conceived it. But of course, in March 2020, the pandemic arrived to Mexico. And from then, I have had to rely mainly, well, in the last months, in the last 6 months, I have been able to return to Chiapas, but it was a long period of time that I had to rely only on long distance communication through social networks. And I have to say that one of the best things that I have done is with this research was to open a Facebook account and to discover the multiple forums and people talking about Chol culture, their language, the history and heritage. And And these social media interactions turned out to be essential with the stay-at-home directives, with the Kolenki Awochoch, the stay-at-your-house directives. So as part of this safe distance activities organized by the Chiapas state government and along with the director of the Casa de Cultura of the town of Tumbalá, we planned one online public talk about the ancient Maya and archaeology to be streamed through one of the state's Facebook pages. The event was for my standards, was widely successful. The video quickly accumulated a couple of thousands of views. And some viewers suggested the idea of creating more videos. And so this is the reason I decided to continue digitally with my dissemination campaign. So I created a YouTube channel called Archaeological, which means archaeology with Xcoquiscol, which is Xcoquiscol is my old nickname. And I also opened a Facebook page named La Ñohtielop, which means your ancestors, a name that was suggested by a Chol speaker. So with the content I create, with the help of the generous collaborations of Mayanist colleagues and Chol translators, I try to disseminate through short videos what archaeologists and epigraphists know about the ancient Maya, narrated by a Chol native speaker with Spanish subtitles. Some of them have English subtitles as well. Most of the scripts have been the product of unpaid collaboration of Mayanist colleagues, contributing with a short 500 to 600 word text explaining a subject of their specialization. And some of them have been previously suggested by all members, all audience members. So I have a total of 7 videos published so far, and all of them have accumulated about 50,000 views, which I never expected to be that successful. I know that, but for internet standards, it's not really a lot, but so it's so niche that in Chol language, it's widely successful for my standards. So I hope that with these efforts to make available to a Chol audience archaeological knowledge, I can help to provide tools for its appropriation and use to change institutional and legal terms of engagement between Mayan-speaking communities, the academics and the industries, and all the activities related to things such as salvage archaeology and research, material curation and exhibition, management of archaeological sites, its economic impacts, heritage phenomena, and all the dialogues that are put together in a region that includes such a melting pot of points of view as the World Heritage Site of Palenque. So I really can hope that I can contribute a little, but the more I advance into my research, I am more sure that anything short of starting the dialogues and process towards a deep reform of the heritage legislation in Mexico, it would be just recolonizing the indigenous voice and their narratives to keep legitimating archaeology as the only authentic custodian of the ancient history of the peoples that have dwelt in Mexico. It seems very easy to fall into what Cristóbal Ñeco, a Colombian archaeologist, describes as the neoliberal auto-congratulations by just superficially include a multicultural rhetoric on research. But I believe that we need to change the whole scheme of authority and submit our research not just to the national standards and conservation codes, but to include the consent of indigenous representations erected and governed by themselves after a long process of dialogue and consultation. It's not going to be quick, but we need to end up in a situation in which we can be conditioned the access to our research, denied our research, or just limit what we can do and we cannot do with our object of study. So thank you. I hope there are some questions. And
Sorry, I was just figuring out the emojis. Okay, well, before I have any comments or questions, I wanted to open it up to anybody out there or in the room if they have any comments or questions for Esteban, our speaker here. Okay, so I will get us started, actually. Obviously, I invited you because I know this is an ongoing discussion, and it's a difficult one, particularly in Mexico, and it doesn't look the same as North America, right? In what ways, because you've been involved in this in a while now, in what ways would you see major differences between this push of decolonizing in Mexico versus what you're seeing here in the States in North America?
Well, there's a lot of ways. The whole North American identities and the construction of both Canada and the United States are very different from Mexico and Latin America. In Mexico, we don't have sovereign states as indigenous communities. We are all equal under the law, even though we have international agreements that are really against that. But even with all the multicultural rhetoric that the state has included in their legislation, it has not achieved any sovereignty. The sovereignties that there are for example, the Zapatista communities, the 18 Zapatista communities, they have achieved indeed sovereignty, but it's a de facto one and on the margins, and always fighting against hegemony. And also in the United States, you don't have a centralized federal government institution that regulates all archaeology, and that makes us in Mexico very comfortable with our own monopoly. We are working under the permit of our laws, and we are not doing any crime, and we don't need to ask any permission to any community. Of course, we need to, we cannot just go to many places and work without some dialogues. But we always have the law on our side, and the prevalence of science and what we do as more important than any other contestation. And that has been really different from the Anglo-speaking world. United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia have very different relation with the indigenous communities that live there. But I think mainly is the centralized institution that we have, the INA, the Instituto Nacional de Antropología e Historia, that effectively monopolizes and gives permission or denies permission to anyone wanting to do archaeology. We kind of need the equivalent, an equivalent representation outside of the state, formed by indigenous collective, and that's not going to be easy. It's going to take a long time, and a lot of fights with my Mexican colleagues, with our Mexican colleagues.
Well, to that end, I'm not sure what your opinion is. I know I was forwarded this bulletin as recently as October 2022 that states that INA has to notify indigenous communities if their territory is going to be disturbed. Do you see that as another kind of hollow?
It is exactly. And well, to give an example, there is a big development project in the whole Mexican Maya region, including Chiapas, Tabasco, Quintana Roo, Campeche, and Yucatan states, of the making of a big regional touristic train to travel. And they did, supposedly, according to the international accords, they did an indigenous consultations to make that, but it was terribly done. And actually, it was fought against many indigenous collectives and organizations that it was terribly done. It was done first of all, conditioning their rights to approve that project, which just that disqualifies that consultation, and there were many vices in the process. So yes, unfortunately, the INA is just this institution is just doing what really needs to be written down and showed off to the media. That's just to make a lot of waves about what they are doing. But yeah, it's a and when I talk to my Mexican colleagues, it's always this notion that any other alternative is open it would mean to open the archaeological heritage to the private industry, which is not true. And I guess there was a lot of discussions the same of some of the same discussions were at the United States before NACPRA and where NACPRA was being discussed. Many people thinking that archaeology could disappear and we can be and to give chance to discourses like Graham Hancock and all that crap, the ancient aliens and those interpretations that are really, it's our fault that are so prevalent. They are so prevalent. So yeah, it's going to be a long process, and I am sure the change is going to come from outside our disciplines, as it is already happening and contested by many collectives, organizations, and communities in Mexico and Guatemala as well.
Well, I have to admit that obviously these kinds of discussions have been happening a lot lately. And in fact, they were at the center of the most recent archaeological division meetings at the AAAs, especially in Mexico and Latin America. I find myself in a fragile position, I think, or in this, or maybe I am timid in the fact that I am in between as a foreign guest that has to answer to those national powers that issues those permits, and then also pays and hires the Chol community, the same community that refers to those Mayas, those others, as we excavate. And so the connection there, as you said, is not always as strong. To what degree do you challenge the status quo as a foreigner and as an outsider, or do you make small concessions or changes inside that still foster change but do not overstep? I do not see myself as a voice for others, as you said at the beginning of your presentation. So what are some of the challenge or the steps or the actions that can be taken by an outsider, by a foreigner that's still, especially one working at Palenque, at a UNESCO World Heritage Site, in and of itself is this kind of political, I mean, it's of national interest, of course. And so, yeah, I would like to get your opinion on that.
Well, it's a work that needs to be done mainly by Mexicans because it's our laws that we have to change. But it's not, I understand completely the difficult position that many foreign archaeologists working in Mexico are, because these decolonial ideas have gone mainstream. It's pretty standard everywhere in the world. But if you need a permit from a federal institution, it's completely understandable to do what you can to open participation and be very clear and transparent about what you do, and not getting involved in the political struggles that are contingent among Mexican archaeologists. I completely understand. It's at the end of the day, it's, as I said, it's gonna come from outside. Well, even though I am absolutely certain that we as archaeologists, and that's why I'm doing this, have to make a step towards a change. We cannot, remain comfortable with the situation we have currently. But nonetheless, even we can make a lot of propositions, open forums, and whatever. But the change is going to come from outside, as it is already happening. It's slow, and it's going to take a long time. Long durée, long-term changes, but it's going to change. It's going to change. But yeah, it's complicated, and I understand you perfectly.
Oh, no, by no means does that give me a pass. It is actually because I think that you raise an important point, is that these communities are very diverse. Even within the same community, you have evangelical, you have Catholic, you have, and
same
so
family, yeah.
Have the same opinion of heritage or the same opinion of the past. And so navigating that, I think, and not condensing them down to one community or one identity.
Yeah.
As well. So
yeah, and to make a fight about something that is not enarbolated by a community is just as colonial as appropriating things. It's appropriating a voice that is not yours, and a fight that is not ours as non-indigenous. So yeah. And as you say, it's complex. Even within the families of Palenque, you have widely diverse opinions within one family, or many families. It's different among members, and not just, and more so within the communities and within the municipality of Palenque, and within the state, and all the Mayas. It's very complex. Yeah.
okay, does anybody, before I just monopolize this, because I can just talk about him about this all day, anybody else have any questions or comments for Esteban? Okay, well, thank you again. I know that you say it's like 8:30 or 9:30 now for you in Rome, so I want to thank you for giving us the time so late. Well, I know it's not late for you, it's late for me. But I want to thank you for sharing this with us. This is really special. Thank you.
Well, my pleasure. Anytime.
All right, everyone else, thank you very much for tuning in. Have a good rest of your day.
Good afternoon there. Good evening here. Bye.
Bye.